Ken Burns' new film, The Vietnam War, features testimony from nearly 100 witnesses, including Americans who fought in the war, others who opposed it, and Vietnamese combatants and civilians from both the winning and losing sides. Winters resident and farmer Craig McNamara is the son of Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense during the war. He joins us to talk about his perspective next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Craig, what do the words Vietnam War mean to you when you hear them?
Scott, a flood of emotions, a flood of memories, both past and present, fill me when you bring those words to us today. And we can delve into that. Most of my life has, in one way or another, had Vietnam as part of it. Certainly, I was born in 1950, so as my father went to Washington, D.C. as President Kennedy's cabinet minister, the war unfolded during my teenage years. Very, very critical time in our nation's life, in my life, in my peers who fought on behalf of this great nation. And so as you can see today, it still brings a great deal of emotion in my voice.
I can see it in your face as well. What was your relationship like with your father?
You know, our relationship was one, I believe, of deep love, of deep respect. We shared, the woman who was his wife was my mom and was one of the kindest, humble people of any person I've ever known. And I think she served as a tremendous bridge for us during those most difficult times when many fathers and sons in disagreement broke their relationship. And we all know, as people growing up in that era, what that meant. Shattered families. And I hear stories to this day of what those experiences were like for those individuals.
Your father was such an outsized figure, and it dawns on me that we never hear much about your mom. Who was she? My
mom, Margaret McKinstry Craig, and hence my name. I'm so honored that my middle name, which is the name I go by, is her last name, was a woman who grew up in Piedmont and Alameda. She was so in touch with nature and Mother Nature. As a matter of fact, I remember growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And by the way, Dad was an executive at Ford Motor Company. He made a very wise decision, and that was to raise his family in a university town, outside of all of the corporate headquarters of Dearborn in Michigan. And I so appreciated that. Mom would take us down to the butcher shops because she studied biology, and we would bring home lungs and hearts and eyeballs, and in the kitchen we'd dissect them. We'd put straws into the lungs and see how the lung action worked. We would look at the different brains. That was my mother, and that continued throughout our lives together. Just a thirst for nature, a joy of education.
It's interesting you mentioned the fact that your dad, while people focus so much on his term as Secretary of Defense, he was in the military, he was the CEO of Ford for a brief time, he was the president of the World Bank. There were a lot more dimensions than just this era of his life, but it seems to have defined him, almost frozen him in amber in some way. Why do you think that is?
I think we as a society, as a group of individuals focused on history, will always, by nature, do that. You know, the book by David Halberstam, The Best and the Brightest. Well, I think the Camelot era, the President Kennedy's cabinet ministers, many of them were the best and the brightest.
They were called the Whiz Kids.
They were called the Whiz Kids. Well, actually the Whiz Kids were the 10 individuals that by and large came from from the Harvard Business School and went into Ford in the late 40s and through the 50s. And those were the 10 individuals that raised to vice presidents, and eventually, as you said, my dad was the first non-Ford family member to become president of Ford Motor Company, and he served in that position 6 months. And I remember the day he came home, I was 10, and he said, well, what would you think about moving to Washington, D.C.? And I said, well, Dad, don't worry about it. I'm not going. I've got my friends right here in Michigan. I've got my tree house. You and Mom go. And he said, well, I've been asked by President Kennedy to be part of his cabinet. And our lives changed, his life changed forever, and our lives changed forever.
And for him, the era that he was defense secretary, which spanned not just the Kennedy years, but the Johnson years, a lot of time is focused on things like the Cuban Missile Crisis in those eras. Were you aware of that as a young boy, those events going on around you?
You know, at age 12, remember it was October, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis were those middays in the month of October in 1962. So I was a 12-year-old, but yes, I do recall them. I recall my dad coming home from what we've learned subsequently is the closest time we came to nuclear war. He and his cadre, he and the president and the defense people thought that this was close to the end of the world as we knew it. At the conclusion of that critical time, Mrs. Kennedy gave the president, my father, and a few other individuals a memento for us all to remember the dire consequences had we done that. And it's something that as a child I grew up with. It's a calendar. It's a calendar of the month of October 1962, mounted on what is a piece of black walnut, which is interesting because I'm a walnut grower. And I remember this calendar sitting on a coffee table and Dad coming home from the Department of Defense, 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. My mom would have prepared a quick meal and he would have his hands on this calendar. And as you see, the 13 days are embedded, and almost as if by braille. I would be sitting where you are, and I would be telling him about my day at Sidwell Friends School and what we were doing in the football team, and he would be reading this. And I can only imagine today what he must have been thinking, that we had almost come to the end of the world.
He had a conversation years later with Fidel Castro.
He did.
And he asked Castro, you know, if the United States had taken action, what would he have recommended, Fidel Castro, to Khrushchev? Yeah. And Castro told him that he would have advised the Soviets, Khrushchev and the Soviets, to launch.
Absolutely.
And Castro said back to your father, and you would have done the same thing. And your father's observation was that rational people make decisions that, these are my words, not his, defy rationality.
I think that's true. I think that's true. And remember, in that meeting was Nikita Khrushchev's son. So you had Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara, Comandante Fidel Castro, and a representative from Russia. And they were going over the misunderstandings, the miscommunications that existed in all three of those countries. But the end game was exactly as you portray it.
So when you think about that and how close we came to mutual destruction,
annihilation,
potentially the destruction of the entire planet.
Yeah, 90 miles apart, Cuba and Florida.
Did your father ever communicate any bit of vulnerability in terms of being so close to that decision?
You know, I'm sure he did to my mother. My father was a very private individual, and the last thing that he wanted to talk to me about was the stress of his work. Throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis at age 12, throughout the Vietnam War when I was a teenager, and even into later life. When he published his book, in retrospect, I believe that was in the 90s, I said to him, Dad, that was, what, 20, 30 years later. I said, Dad, why couldn't you have begun this process earlier? You left the Department of Defense in 1968. You were president of the World Bank for a host of years. And I guess it's just something that we all have to, in our own time and space, come to grips with. But I'm so proud of what he was able to do with Errol Morris in The Fog of War. And I suggest that every high school student view this, not because it's my father, but because it's the history of the 20th century, the hundreds of thousands of lives that we lost globally through wars and inequalities. And from this movie, my father drew several lessons, the most important one of which is to empathize with your enemy.
He said that he was at some function, and I don't know whether it's a direct counterpart, but a counterpart that was part of the Vietnamese political military establishment. And he said to your father, the way your father characterized it, very frustratedly, that we were never against you, we were never for the Chinese, we have always fought the Chinese, and was frustrated because he felt that America never took the time to get them.
I'm not a historian, I'm a farmer. So I have to base my understanding on what I grew up with. I understand that perspective. And I think my father's generation were very worried about the domino effect. So if one country goes, then another country goes, and then you've got communism throughout the world. My age group didn't grow up with that. So we saw things from a different perspective. And importantly to me, when I would say to Dad, if you no longer believed in our policy, why didn't you stand up against it at an earlier time? And his response was, he was an appointed member of the cabinet. He was not an elected. So different generations view things differently, and I honor that.
How do you feel as now a man of, how old are you now?
67.
67. A man of 67 who's done many things, walked many roads in your life. After all this time, and with the distance that brings perspective, how do you feel about your father's role in the Vietnam War?
Let me tease that into a bigger question. How has the Vietnam War changed our global strategic positioning? I think that's the critical thing. I never lost love for my father, and he never lost love for me. We had a wonderful relationship till the day he died, and I was holding his hand when he died. So, how did it impact the families who lost their sons primarily in Vietnam? How did it affect our returning Vietnam veterans who are friends of mine and yours, who suffered incredible problems as they returned and to this day? How has it affected the millions of Vietnamese who were lost and the additional millions who suffer today from Agent Orange and from ordnance that's still unexploded?
How did it affect you when you, as a college student, as a young man developing his own life, when you heard either through the news media or from people confronting you directly about your father's participation, how did that impact you?
It was very difficult. I'm not going to hide that. I had significant ulcers. I had beginning to lose my, not my faith in this country, but my perspective in this country. And as a sophomore in college, I dropped out in 1971, and together with two very close friends, set out on a journey to Latin America.
Really?
No Spanish under our belts. And my best friend said, well, we must do this on motorcycles. And I said, come on, Will, let's hitchhike or get a VW bus or go on a bus. He said, no, let's try it. So we set off and through Mexico, and finally made it to Panama, not realizing that there was a Darien Gap. You could not go through the jungle to Colombia. We made it to Colombia. They stayed, and I said, I've had it with a bike. And that launched me on a 1.5-year journey by hitchhiking through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And along the way, working on peasant farms and sustaining farms. And it was that experience of working side by side with people who were growing the food to feed to their animals and to feed to their children, and that was their only subsistence. And it all of a sudden brought the side of politics in my life to the side of the land. And the journey to become a farmer. With little knowledge, little experience, I applied to UC Davis to get that experience. So appreciated that, and that was what launched my career.
Isn't it
today.
a bit of elegant symmetry that, almost going back to the classic line about beating swords into plowshares, that your chosen vocation is sort of the epitome of it's nurturing, it's growth, it's creating life.
That's a powerful parallel that you just drew, and I had not put it into those terms, but I appreciate that. And I have to thank my mother and my father, because I think as young people, I'm talking 3, 5, 7, the experiences that we have shape our lives. And my experience was my dad out in the garden in Ann Arbor, picking a big, beautiful tomato and just having a shaking salt on, taking a big bite, juice coming down, and picking artichokes with my mom and asparagus. In the fall, going out to the apple orchards in Michigan. Those are the memories, and I appreciate that. And that's today what we need to give to our younger generation. We need to bring them to nature. You know, there's a nature deficit disorder has been a term that's been coined for the disconnect, and we need to heal that.
What do you think, if your dad was here today, what do you think he would say about his son and his work?
I think he would be very quiet about turning swords into plowshares. I think that would resonate significantly with him. He often said he couldn't tell the difference between an organic tomato and a conventional tomato. I said, well, it doesn't really matter, Dad. The world probably needs all tomatoes, and as long as you keep eating them, that's good. But you know, as president of the World Bank, he and my mom probably traveled to 100, I don't remember in 1978 how many global countries there were, but I bet there were 190. He and my mom traveled to almost all of them. And you know what the projects were? Agriculture.
Really?
Now, we remember the Green Revolution, and I don't think we have time today to talk about that, nor should we. But power, dams, one of the most important things to my father in his career, 65 years of career, was working with the World Bank to end river blindness in Africa. River blindness comes from individuals drinking out of the watersheds and rivers that they have and becoming blind as a 4-year-old, as a 14-year-old, as a 24-year-old. And the weight on society of having to care for individuals who are blind, who cannot be productive as they were, that was reversed. And I think, as I said, he was not a farmer, and he didn't really touch farming, but some of the work that he did, that the World Bank did under his leadership, was very profound.
It really speaks to the complexity of a man, any woman's life.
Yeah, it does.
It raises a question for me, because when you talk about the work he did at the World Bank, when you talk about him as a father out in the garden, it just sort of reveals the layers of complexity. Your father once said, in talking about World War II, that the famous General Curtis LeMay had said that they were talking about the bombing of World War II.
Yeah, of
Japan. And he said, if we had lost, we would have been seen and judged as war criminals. But because we were the victors, their acts were judged as being beneficial
Right.
and positive. And it raises for me the question that when we are looking at someone through the lens of history, what are by what attributes should they really be judged?
Oh my goodness. Let's put that thought on hold for just a second and go back to the genesis of that and the war criminal. That was the atomic bomb. That was what my father was talking about. And throughout his career in the Defense Department and his career for the next 25 years, he worked for nuclear disarmament. And I think he would be very disturbed to see where we are today in terms of nuclear arsenals and the emphasis on development of those across the world. So your question that I put on the side is?
That when you're judging
a person,
a figure in history,
we need to be very careful.
and when you look at the totality of your father's involvement in so many different aspects, it's hard to pick out
Right.
by what standard you measure him by.
I think as people, we tend to cherry pick what we want to believe. And unfortunately, our society today is doing that even more. And one of my own personal endeavor of integrity is to try not to do that. Because we all can do it. There's certainly leaders of past administrations that I could get very upset about.
What conversation of that era with your father do you remember most?
I do recall a conversation at age 19 in the backyard of a good friend of mine, a colleague of mine, in his Georgetown home. So it was his mom and father, my mother and father, and a few others at a social event. And the discussion was about Vietnam. And as a 19-year-old, it's true, we didn't know everything that my father knew. We didn't know everything that our generals and chiefs of staff knew. But we had a substantial belief that this war was not correct. And we were bringing that up in this social environment. And I remember him saying, "You just haven't read what I've read." And as a 19-year-old, to me, that was a false statement.
If you were back in that conversation this moment, what would you have asked him that you didn't have the presence of mind to at that moment?
I think what I probably did say, or what I would say today is you're right. We're not privy to the information and the confidential information that you have. But we do have a pulse on what our society is feeling that you may not have. There was a young man who emulated himself in front of the Defense Department, a Quaker, with his daughter, and gave his daughter as he burned himself to death. That incident, and many incidents that my father saw firsthand, must have devastated him.
He took on a big sacrifice in order to take that position.
He did.
It paid very little compared to being the president of Ford. What was it about Jack Kennedy that led him to move off of what was already a glowing path for himself and to take on essentially this huge responsibility that there was no way to know where it was going to lead to?
I think historically, looking at presidencies, look at what President Kennedy inherited. Ike had set in motion with the CIA the Bay of Pigs. So Kennedy becomes president. He's inaugurated in January. In April, 1,300 Cubans head off from Mexico to take over Fidel's revolution. My dad was on the job 3 months. The president was on the job 4 months maybe. These are the tasks, jobs, and heavy lifting that our leaders take on, and almost insurmountable.
One last thing.
Yeah.
Very quickly, what's the most important lesson your father ever taught you?
Wow, that's an important one. I would say, he never said it this way, but I do believe integrity. And he was a man of tremendous integrity. And ultimately, well, let me say what my mom taught me: humility and authenticity. And together, those are things that I've attempted to incorporate in my life. And I'm honored to be the son of Robert and Margaret.
Thank you, Craig. And that's our show. Thanks to our guest, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, we create thoughtful solutions to help the Capital Region thrive, from economic development and education to public health and safety, issues that are vitally important to Sacramento's prosperity. We're proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.